Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Aaron Woodrick, the Director of Domestic Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Robert D. Atkinson, who's the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in Washington, D.C. Dr. Atkinson is one of the most sought-after advisors on innovation and technology policy and the author of multiple books on economics and innovation. And he's actually held advisory appointments under a number of different American presidents, including Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. And we're especially thrilled about the forthcoming paper being released right after this webinar that he has authored, being released by the MLI, entitled Big is Beautiful, Strengthening Growth and Competition in the Canadian Economy, which applies many of his insights from his most recent book, Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Mythology of Small Business, applying a lot of those concepts to the Canadian context. So I want to thank you, Rob, for taking the time today to discuss your forthcoming paper.
Aaron, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And I should also mention that I'm a proud Canadian, having grown up born in Calgary, grown up much of my life, or some of my life, in Toronto.
That's great. We like to make a lot of our guests honorary Canadians, but you are a bona fide born Canadian. So welcome, of course. Now, I wanted to start by sort of talking about your book, Big is Beautiful, a great book. I highly recommend it to anyone interested in competition policy generally. And it makes a somewhat counterintuitive case to a lot of people because big businesses are not very popular. It makes the case for big business in America. So I guess the first question is there a very big difference between the Canadian context and the American context that you've written about?
No, I don't think there is really. Really what we were talking about in that book was embracing what we call size neutrality, my co-author, Michael Lind, and I. And the reason we were at minimum size neutrality, because what's happened is that the narrative over the last 10 or 15 years has really gone towards small business good, big business bad. And therefore, we should do everything possible to help small business and at the same time restrain, restrict, or harm big businesses. The problem with that is, we'll see when we talk, I think, in our discussion, big businesses are superior to small businesses on average over a course of many different important indicators. Again, this isn't to say that there aren't some large businesses that are scofflaws and deserve our scorn. But the problem with the way that all works out is you see them in the newspaper or on the media. You don't see the 10 small businesses that do the exact same thing, pollute the environment, hurt their customers, whatever it might be. So I think the issue is pretty much the same in Canada, with only one caveat, is that Canada, frankly, doesn't have enough big businesses. They have way too many small businesses. And why can I say that? Well, because large businesses produce more growth. They produce a higher GDP. They produce all these other benefits. And so that's really, if you will, an Achilles heel of the Canadian economy. And I think even more so that Canadian policymakers should embrace size neutrality.
Now, I know a lot of people will sort of raise their eyebrows at that sort of assertion, which you back up, I think, in the paper and in your book with some facts about why big businesses are better for the economy. But I wanted to back up first and sort of start with the sort of overall narrative that you talk about. You talk about the seductive appeal of this small is beautiful school of thought. So I wonder if you can sort of expand. What do you mean by that? And why do you think it has sort of really become the predominant narrative over the last decade or two?
Yeah, so the most recent Canadian federal budget, government budget, proclaimed, quote, "Successful, innovative, and competitive small business are what drive a strong and growing middle class." That's simply just not true. They're just not true at all, as we'll see. Big businesses in Canada are much more important to a strong and thriving middle class. But why do governments of all parties really kind of embrace that narrative? Well, one reason is, particularly for liberals or progressives, it's a way to make it look like you're not anti-business. Even progressives know that the average voter understands that business is important to a society in terms of innovation and products and growth and jobs and competitiveness. So they can't afford to be, we hate all business. Maybe the most sort of socialist candidate can, but even progressives can't do that. So they have to pretend or show that, or try to convince voters that they like business. It's just we like small businesses. So on the progressive side, small businesses are sort of like aligned with the proletariat. We're aligned with workers and small businesses. And it's the big businesses, the capitalists, we're opposed to. Well, what what they forget is that there's lots and lots of small businesses that make really high profits. And they do that sometimes at the expense of their workers. And so this notion somehow we're aligned with small businesses because they're part of the people and big businesses is not. That's one of the reasons why there's that seductive appeal. And also there's just been this narrative all the way back to E.F. Schumacher back in the 70s, small is beautiful. Well, they're local and they don't pollute and all, and again, it's all based upon, or most of it's based upon mythology. It's just a sort of feel good thing. When we all watch Lord of the Rings, we all wanted to live in Hobbiton because it's these little craft businesses and it feels good. And it's like, oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, we also want to have a decent standard of living too, and we don't see those in conflict. So that's, small businesses are just motherhood and apple pie, or I don't know what the Canadian raisin pie is the Canadian analogy.
Butter tarts. I'd probably say butter tarts.
I grew up with butter tarts. Why don't we have those anymore here?
Yeah. So look, I think you're right when you say, if you're a progressive and you want to find a way to still be supportive of business, it's easy to sort of draw these caricatures and say, well, small is good and big is bad. That makes it handy. But I guess on the flip side too, have you seen a change in sort of more conservative politicians who used to sort of be seen as the defenders of business generally, and increasingly, and I think we saw some of this with Donald Trump as well in the United States, where there's a tendency even among conservative politicians to recognize that it's, big business can make a handy villain. And so they too sort of say, okay, well, we like business, but we mean the little guy. We don't mean the big guy.
Yeah, there's a great article, and I get that when you write an op-ed, you don't always get to pick your title, but there's a great Forbes article a number of years ago by Paul Ryan, who ran as vice president with Mitt Romney, very conservative, kind of free market kind of conservative in the U.S., member of Congress, and he wrote something like I can't remember the title, but it was something like I think it was Down with Big Business. And well, why did Ryan say that? Because Ryan, he used to assign he used to assign new staffers Ayn Rand books, so he's like a real free market guy. And so in his mind, big business is any kind of market power. I'm not talking even monopoly, just any kind of market power is sometimes suspect to the libertarian wing. They think that everybody should be, the Adam Smithian small pin makers all competing intensely with one another, and big businesses distort competition. That's part of their view. They also think big businesses, because they lobby, somehow they distort the market because they get government involved. And then more recently now you have the sort of anti-big tech, where you have this, that's the more Trumpian thing, where it's like, well, we don't like big companies or big tech companies because they're purportedly favoring liberal causes. And so it's a whole set of factors that have come together that have really, at least in the US, changed the Republican Party's view towards big business.
Yeah, well, you've laid out sort of the political narrative, and there aren't a lot of people around defending big business these days, which I think makes your book that much more important and this paper. Okay, so you've made the claim that big businesses are better for the economy. So why don't we sort of go through, what are the, if you had to summarize it, what are the main benefits of bigger businesses to the economy as a whole?
Sure, and again, with the caveat being these are all averages. I'm sure there's some big businesses that are not doing well in terms of these performance, and some bit small that aren't. And all Canadian data, mostly from Statistics Canada. I go through it all in the paper, but a number of different studies, big businesses, and that's defined, by the way, as the Canadian government is over 500 employees. They pay their workers 44% more on average. There are some studies that actually found that Canadian large companies pay 72% more than very small companies with less than 20 workers. So right there, that's a pretty serious benefit. They also are much more likely to pay to give their workers different kinds of benefits. So just from a worker perspective, small companies are less valuable, less beneficial to workers. Exports, very important for a Canadian economy that's tied into the global economy to be able to export. In 2017, small businesses exported about 40% of exports were from small business, but about 55% of they accounted for 55% of output. So they export more. They also large businesses are more innovative. Firms with over 250 employees invested 13 times more in innovation activities. This is defined by the Canadian government to include R&D, but also new product development and the like. Yet they employed only 2.7 times more workers. So in other words, they're about 4 times more innovative than small companies on average, even though small companies on average get this beneficial special R&D credit just for being small and other things. They're also, frankly, just better jobs. Large companies are more likely to employ female workers. Large companies are twice as more likely to be unionized. There's a good study by the Canadian government on assessing job quality, and it looked at things not just wage levels, but job security, the autonomy a worker has in his or her job, the flexibility of the schedule, the support on the job, benefits. And they found that large companies were significantly more likely to have high quality jobs than small companies. And the last one, which is important because we all hear about this issue, which is quite important, about growing income inequality. Yet when you look at the data, the gap between the top earners in a firm and the bottom earners is 55% higher than in small firms than large firms. So the income inequality in small firms is very, very high. The owner is making a lot of money relative to the lowest paid worker, and that's higher than in large companies. So again, on all of these indicators, on average, large companies perform better.
I'm sure that last stat would be surprising to a lot of folks who like to zero in on, CEOs of big companies that take home a big paycheck. So that's a very eye-opening stat. I want to unpack some of these stats that you've noted. First of all, on the wage point, you say that Canadian big firms pay on average 44% more. I guess the first question is, why is that so? Why are larger firms able to pay higher salaries?
Well, wages are, on average, determined by productivity. If you don't have high productivity, it's hard to pay high wages. And the Statistics Canada finds, quote, firm productivity is generally positively correlated with average pay. They also find that large companies in Canada are more productive, higher labor productivity than small companies. So, for example, in Canadian manufacturing plants with 100 or fewer workers, their productivity was 62% of industry average, so they're quite low. But the largest firms had a productivity of 65% more than the average. So large companies in Canada, they're more productive. Therefore, they're able to pay their workers more and at the same time be price competitive. What's really, I think, interesting and disturbing, though, is it's not just that small firms have lower productivity, but the gap between small and large in Canada is a lot higher than in the US. Small firm productivity was about 50% of large firm productivity in the US, in Canada. In the US, I'm sorry, it's only about a third less. So small firms in Canada are much less productive than big firms, and that ratio is even larger than in the United States.
Is that also a function of profitability? I mean, obviously, if a business is more profitable, they can, in theory, pay their workers more. So is it true that, on average, larger firms are more profitable, and that accounts for part of the reason that they can pay their employees more?
Well, I was not able to find one of the things I was discovered in this was that which I didn't know before, is that U.S. data is better than Canadian data when it comes to businesses. There's just more of it. So I wasn't able to find, that's an interesting question I looked at, but I was able to find U.S. data for our book. And what's interesting is actually it's the opposite. Looking at IRS data in the US, Internal Revenue Service data, small corporations actually had a higher rate of profit than larger corporations, which again is totally counter to the narrative we hear all the time. Oh, it's the larger corporations that are, screwing the workers and screwing their customers and all. But actually it was small companies. No, it's largely just the fact that these companies have just such superior productivity. And there's a positive dynamic there. They have higher productivity, so they can train their workers more, which they do. They can perhaps treat their workers more. They also invest more in capital equipment. That then is
a virtuous circle.
It's this virtuous circle. Then their workers become more productive. Then they can pay them more. They get better workers, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, that's very interesting. You talked a bit about exports and innovation and how bigger firms are better at those things. Why is that? Why is this a function? If you're a larger business, you've got to look for new markets and sort of get out there and be proactive in a way that if you're a smaller business that isn't focused on growth. Is that the main difference?
Well, I think part of the main difference is that there's a good study in the US that we cite that found that larger companies, when they're doing R&D, they're able to apply their R&D to many different areas within the firm, whereas small companies, because they're more narrow. So the R&D is more productive on average in large firms. So they're able to innovate more out of the same dollar of R&D. That's one thing. The second thing is that there are real scale effects. I mean, this is all boils down really in some simple way to scale effects. When you're larger and you're doing R&D, let's say you're doing R&D and you have to spend $10 million to develop a widget. If you're $100 million company and then you keep selling more and more, the marginal cost of that is low because you're amortizing your R&D over a much bigger sales base. So when you're a small company and you do a lot of R&D fixed cost and you're not selling that many units, it's hard to do that. And so there is a scale effect in R&D. And oftentimes people are like, oh, well, small companies are super innovative. That's not quite true. It tends to be maybe newer companies can be pretty innovative, but small companies on the whole generally are not anywhere near as innovative as large ones.
And that's a really interesting distinction to make, is that being small is not the same as being new. And that's something that I think when we get to, talking about some of your recommendations, and in terms of things governments can do for small business, there's a difference between the ones that have the potential to get big versus ones that don't. I was thinking, and I know you talk in your book, Big is Beautiful, a bit about, the pizzeria, right? If you have a couple that wants to start a pizza place, they might make a good living doing it. They might hire a few people, but really there's sort of nothing beyond them making pizza, selling it, making a living doing it. Whereas if you're a large, like a Domino's Pizza, which I'm a fan of, they've spent money on all sorts of fancy technology, so you can order it online, and I know they experimented with delivering pizza with drones and things like that. But as you say, because there's a scale benefit there, it's reasonable for a company like Domino's to say we will spend millions of dollars, developing drone pizza delivery. Whereas if you're just a mom and pop shop with one, it just would not be feasible or realistic to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You also made a point about small businesses creating the most jobs, and you sort of you made an interesting point that there was more to that claim than meets the eye. So what is it that you're skeptical about when you hear people throw around the claim that small businesses create more jobs than other types of businesses? In what way is that misleading in your view?
Well, it's misleading in the sense that it's wrong. So. The last refuge of a scoundrel. What was that line? In this case, the last refuge of anybody is job creation. If you can at least have job creation, okay, you kind of win the day, you win the battle. So that's why this job creation argument is so important. In the U.S., it turns out that large businesses create slightly more jobs than small businesses. But in Canada, according to StatCan, from 2002 to 2020, small businesses added jobs at half the rate of large businesses. So in the last, 18 years, small businesses were not producing that many jobs compared to large businesses. Now, one of the reasons we think that is we just hear all the time, oh, look at all these startups and they create all these jobs. But it's as one analyst said, it's sort of the iconic revolving door. In the U.S., according to Small Business Administration data, you get this big chunk of new jobs created by companies formed in their first year. So massive numbers of jobs every year by these companies forming in their first year. Then if you trace them over time, a longitudinal study, take the firm and follow it for 20 years, they lose jobs on average every year until the year 18. So that's because they go out of business. So they create all these jobs in the first year, and then a bunch of them go out of business, and maybe a few survive. So we just hear all this about, oh, jobs. Look at this new company that created jobs, but what we ignore is that they're losing jobs at a much faster rate than larger companies. And at the end of the day, is that really good? Is it good for Joe and Sally to have a pizza shop that goes out of business after a year and they lose their savings? Is it good for those workers who got laid off? And I'm not saying they shouldn't be able to do it, sure. But should we be subsidizing that? That's a whole different question.
So it's interesting. It's a very cherry-picked stat to talk only about the jobs that are being created, but not talking about the jobs that are being lost over time. And when you do that, you're saying it paints a very different picture.
Yeah, you have to look at net job creation. And when you look at net job creation, it's a very different picture.
That's very interesting. I want to jump to, we got a question here. There's a senator from Senate of Canada who's watching the webcast who's posed a question. And it's Senator Colin Deacon, and he has asked, he says, based on Canadian data, I'm wondering about the extent to which public policy should protect big business from competition, from smaller enterprises, or whether anti-competitive policies are a problem. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, our view is that again, you should have government should have size neutral policies. I think the worst thing a government can do would be to protect incumbents against competition. Oftentimes what you find is that is when small companies are threatening economically big companies, it's not because they want to stay small, it's because they want to get big. So absolutely, you want that healthy dynamic in an economy. The worst thing a country could do would be, besides breaking up big companies intentionally, the worst thing they could do would be to the opposite, which is to protect them from robust competitors. So nothing in what I'm saying, either in the book or in the paper, Aaron, that you're releasing today, is that government should protect incumbents. Like, for example, I spoke, I don't know, a couple of years ago at a Competition Bureau Canada event, and I was talking about fintech and how at least there were a couple of cases at the time. I don't know how they were resolved, but where large banks were making it hard for small fintech companies to engage in essentially their what are called application protocol interfaces. And in contrast, the UK government passed laws and rules that made that a much more competitive market, so that fintech startups could really get in the market and challenge big banks. I think that's great, because ultimately those small companies want to get big.
We talking about competition policy generally. In your book, you sort of you give a few examples of well-intentioned, we're going to break up the big guy because we need to, but the end result was very bad for consumers. So I wonder if you just highlight a couple of those historical examples. I don't know if all Canadians would be familiar with them, where the government thought they were doing a good thing and preventing a monopoly, but the end result for consumers was actually not good.
Well, and workers. So a good example of that is Xerox. Xerox was the largest printer company in the world. And in the 70s, the FTC, our Federal Trade Commission, said, we want to force Xerox to have more competition. And if their market share is not cut by half in 5 years, we'll have failed the market. So what they forced Xerox to do, and I'm not making this up, is to give away for free all of their intellectual property for printers. And in fact, in 5 years, their market share was cut in half. And who took it? The Japanese. Canon, Ricoh, all those other companies. They just took all that Xerox, those patents, those even drawings.
Who wouldn't?
For free. And then they gained market share. Oh, maybe at the margin that helped consumers a tad, but it was really a very significant blow to the U.S. economy. I'll give you another one, which I'm sure will hit home. Western Electric, which was the arm of AT&T, was essentially the telecom equipment maker. It owned it would own the Bell Canada equipment maker. I wrote about this recently in an article called "Who Lost Lucent," and the U.S. DOJ forced Western Electric to divest that, which became Nortel. Now that was good for you. At least for a while, until the Chinese put Nortel out of business by stealing their IP.
Yep.
It was really good for you, but at the end of the day, wait a minute, wouldn't it have been better if if Western Electric and the Canadian subsidiary were all one entity? Maybe they would have been stronger, and maybe both would have survived instead of both essentially being dead now. So there's oftentimes this sort of moralistic view. Well, we'll do this, but what the problem is now in an intense global economy. It just ignores the fact that you can lose very significantly to foreign companies and just completely go out of business.
And speaking about competition more generally, I mean, I still think it's, as a general principle, people agree that competition is good in a market economy, but you think there are important caveats to that, and that sometimes more competition, especially for its own sake, is not a good thing. So what are some of the conditions under which less competition is actually good or desirable for a country or for consumers?
So the narrative, I think, of a lot of folks, particularly some conventional antitrust people, but particularly now, there's sort of what we call neo-Brandeisian movement, which you have in Canada as well, which is this, big is bad, break up everybody. The narrative is that the benefits of competition are linear. So if 5 units of competition is good, 10 units is even better. If you take that to the logical extreme, every industry in Canada should be like the dry cleaning industry. No market power. Well, the problem with that is that economists like William Baumol have showed that unless you have some market power, you can't make enough profits to go and invest in the next big risky thing. So the question is not really about market power. It's about it's about the level of it, and it's about what companies are doing. So if the quote monopolists, and really we're not talking about monopolists, we're talking about oligopolists here. If the big companies are using their money just to give shareholders, big returns and not investing in the future, that's a problem. But if the big companies who have market power are using that money to invest in the next generation of innovation, which we've seen, for example, in semiconductors, at least until a while ago, that's not a problem. There's a really good set of arguments or articles and studies, particularly by a French an economist, Philippe Aghion, who have articulated through empirical work that the relationship between competition and innovation is an inverted U. Too little is bad. Too little competition is bad because you just have sluggish monopolies, but too much competition is bad because you can't really make enough money to take those next big risks. So there's a sort of optimal amount that allows some market power, but not too much. And so, where is that? Well, that depends on each industry being different. But the key point is where you hear policymakers in Canada all the time saying more competition is always better. And that simply is not empirically true.
So you're saying that, first of all, the model of sort of linear benefits of competition is not accurate, it's more for you. And then secondly, what the shape that U is exactly depends on the industry in question. It can be different. Is it also fair to say that in terms of, whether there's an industry, Canada, for example, telecoms and airlines are often cited as industries that could use more competition. Is it relevant whether or not the reason for less competition is government obstacles, for example, to entry versus, a bureaucrat or a politician saying, you know what, we only have 2 major players in this industry. We think we need more. And so we're going to take steps to make that happen.
So there's a big difference in policy between enabling competition and forcing competition. And in virtually every industry, government should enable it. They should reduce entry barriers. They should also, where it's possible and makes sense, increase the size of the markets, which we can talk about. So, for example, if there was a North American aviation market, you'd have more competition in Canadian airlines, just because the market would be bigger and there'd be more players. The problem comes when you are in a market where it just doesn't support more entry. And I would put telecom or broadband in that market, in that category. There are certain industries where you have network effects, and so let's just say the government forced maybe to be 4 providers in each area for broadband. Profits would go down. There's no question about that. But costs would go up because it would be so inefficient. There would be so much extra capital expenditures. The operating expenditures would all be higher. And so, profits would go down, but costs would go up. And so again, it's the narrative that so many people on the neo-Brandeisian side argue is just profit, profit, profit. But they have to understand that that's not the issue. What we're ultimately looking at is it's price. That's what we're looking at in a consumer welfare world. And sometimes market concentration can be better because some markets just are naturally concentrated. A good example of that would be car plants. Well, why don't we break up all the car companies so that they only make 100 cars a year? Well, they wouldn't have very high profits, but cars would cost double because you would have no economies of scale in making a car.
I guess one example up here that gets a lot of people's noses out of joint is cell phone providers. We only have 2, 3. There's always been talk about expanding this. Of course, in Canada being a small country, there's also always concern about foreign ownership competitors. And you'd mentioned earlier the example of Xerox, which I appreciate as a unique example because they were forced to give away their IP. But one of the detriments to the United States was you had these Japanese companies come in and essentially, cause harm to an American competitor. What is the best approach for a country like Canada that has a smaller market? How can they expand competition in certain areas without putting their own sort of giants at risk? Because I think that's often the concern of a lot of policymakers here is, well, we'd like more competition, but we don't want to risk, our giants sort of being jeopardized by exposing them to foreign competition.
Well, first of all, that is a serious and legitimate concern in Canada. I mean, that fundamentally is the core challenge in Canada. You're too small to have as much competition as you might like, just because markets aren't big enough. And yet, if you get to sort of optimal amounts of competition, you guaranteed that you're going to reduce Canadian competitors. Now, the challenge in the wireless space is in the U.S. we have three major wireless providers now after T-Mobile and Sprint merged. And that's with a country of 350 million people. And the reason we have three and not seven is because of economies of scale and network effects. It's a super complicated, high capex industry that just doesn't support a lot of players. Now, would the US government allow that to go down to two through a merger? No, absolutely not. We would never allow it to go to two. But at the same time, Canada's 35 million people?
About 1/10.
Yeah. So the idea that somehow with 35, you should have more wireless providers, it doesn't make sense. The market is not big enough to have that many wireless providers in Canada. And so you have to recognize, look, there's going to be tensions. There's going to be trade-offs. How do we best want to balance that rather than say, oh, yeah, well, let's just stick the thumb on the scale and mandate another competitor. That's the conundrum in Canada right now, is this trade-off between size and competition.
And advocates for more competition in wireless often point to the fact that Canadians pay some of the highest prices for the same is true of airlines, for example. But I think you may have touched on this a little earlier when you said that one of the ways you can resolve this is to just increase the market size. So, for example, we treated those spaces, whether wireless or airlines, is a North American market rather than a Canadian market. That would help alleviate that, but that would require Canadian policymakers to accept that there's a possibility that you may end up with American-based companies becoming the dominant forces in those spaces.
Exactly. Or it could go the other way. ITIF, the organization I lead, we have a bank account, and our bank is TD Bank. And it's not because I'm Canadian. It's because TD Bank, at least in Washington, their service and their costs and all that stuff were superior to all the other banks I could see. So there's an example of where Canadian banks came down here and were able to compete successfully. So it's not basically, we shouldn't assume that somehow the Canadian companies would get overthrown, and swamped. But yeah, that certainly is an issue. I think in the wireless space and cost, one of the things, this is a big issue in the US as well. It's not just to simply say, well, they have high prices, because that doesn't tell you anything. You have to look at cost, and the cost of providing wireless or wireline broadband in Canada is among the highest in the world. It's equivalent to Australia and some parts of the US just because of population density. It's a lot cheaper to deliver wireless services in France, for example. So a lot of the anti-company advocates will say, oh, well, look at the cost, look at the price. The price really doesn't tell you what you should look at. The issue is really profitability. I know in the US, for example, our internet service providers are actually slightly less profitable than European internet service providers, but our costs are a little higher because we're a suburban, exurban country, and it's super expensive to put all those wireless towers everywhere and wires everywhere compared to a more densely populated European country.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is, especially things like wireless that require a lot of sort of physical infrastructure, if the cost is a function of, if there's a fixed cost involved, if you have a greater population density, you've just got more customers to spread that cost out over. And so it's sort of inevitable in certain industries where there is a high sort of capital requirement that you're going to have higher costs just because
Yeah.
of there's no getting around that because there's just fewer people to spread the cost out over.
Exactly. You put up one tower and maybe you serve 10,000 people, but in France you might serve 50,000 people.
That's an excellent point. I guess a lot of this has been we've been boosting big business. We've been talking about how big business is actually not the bad guy, or at least not always the bad guy. What do you say to people who sort of view this as an attack on small business? Sort of saying you're saying actually small business is not worthy. They're not they're the bad guy. What do you say to those people? Is there anything that governments can or should do for small businesses that still fits the sort of view that big business is good?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I'm not making a moralistic judgment about small business. I run a small business, and I want massive government subsidies because I do all these great things with being small. Just kidding. It's not about saying small business is bad. It's moving the compass needle more towards the middle and say, look, let's just have size neutrality. Let's stop with the policies that say we got to do everything possible to help small business and do things maybe that would harm big business. So that's number one. Number two is, frankly, I don't know why we can't have that discussion about, well, wait a minute, are small businesses really all that good for workers? I mean, it seems to me what we really ought to be focusing on in public policy is we shouldn't be focusing on business interests. That's not the goal of public policy. Businesses are a means, not an end. What we should be focusing on are consumers and workers and who is being best served. And frankly, there are a lot of small companies that don't treat their workers right. I'll give you an example. In the US, it is legal for a small company of under 15 workers to discriminate on the basis of gender and religion and race. Or I should say it's not illegal. Why is that? Because Congress passed a law, and a good law, to say you can't do that, but it exempted small business. Well, because we have to protect small business. There's just no justification for that kind of thing. Discrimination is bad in and of itself. You look at the Biden proposal recently to require vaccines. Now you can argue that square around. I don't have a problem with it, but some people do. Okay, but his mandate, which was overturned by the courts, was only for businesses with 100 or more people. So imagine if this were Ebola and you die, and we say, oh, we're only going to have big businesses protect their workers. The small business workers, we don't care if they die. So come on. So that's number one. Number two, I think we should be, instead of having a discussion about how do we get more small businesses, we should be talking about how do we get more newer businesses that want to grow. We in the book, we propose getting rid of the U.S. Small Business Administration, or repurposing it to, instead of the SBA, to what we call the NBA, the New Business Administration. So I think there's a role for government to help new businesses get off the ground. You could imagine a 5-year regulatory hiatus. But the idea that somehow once you got 20 workers, you shouldn't have to comply with the same regulations that a bigger company has, it doesn't make any sense. You either care about the environment or you don't. You either care about worker safety or you don't. You either care about racial justice or you don't. So, that's number one. Number two would be, we should be doing everything possible to help small businesses combine. I mean, there are just a lot of sectors where we have too many small businesses, and if we could get them to merge, combine, be taken over, we'd all be better off. And I know you're not supposed to say that these days, but that's the reality. We would be better off. I use this example in our book that if the U.S. had the same firm size distribution as Canada does, our per capita living standards would be about 4% lower. I don't know about you, but I don't want to have the average worker in the U.S. with 4% lower living standards. I think they should deserve more.
Yeah, there's a real tangible impact there. I want to sort of skip. We've already started to touch on these. In your paper, you outlined some policy recommendations. So I think we'll sort of maybe just go through those briefly. You can expand on each of those. And then if there's folks watching, if you have questions, feel free to put a question in the box. I've got a few more lined up. So we'll go through some of these recommendations from your paper and then maybe take a couple more questions at the end if we have time. And you already touched on one on when you were talking about new versus small. One of your recommendations is for policymakers to embrace size neutrality. So maybe you can expand a little bit about why that's important.
Well, because if you don't have size neutrality, if policymakers are putting their thumb on the scale of helping small businesses, you're just distorting the economy in favor of a low productivity, low innovation economy. Uh, that's so all the, in Canada, for example, they have lower taxes. The corporate tax rate is lower for small businesses. The R&D credit is higher for them. There are regulatory exemptions. They get favored in government procurement. I mean, think about that. The government should be procuring the best quality goods at the lowest price. That's all. That's all.
Yeah.
But by putting these other mandates on it, basically the government is paying more, so taxpayers pay more for something. There's just really no reason for that. And again, the core argument there is if when you do all of those policies, you distort your economic structure in favor of less efficient, smaller firms.
Yeah, when you think about it, not a very controversial recommendation to say just you're not asking for special favors for big business. You're saying just don't stack the deck against businesses based on their size. That seems like a pretty reasonable position to take. We touched on this on expanding Canada's market size. What are you talking about? Expanding, trade agreements and sort of do these need to be reciprocal agreements that Canada has with other countries in order to enable them to have better access to a market and perhaps expand their ability to have more competition?
Yeah, I mean, if Canada were a 51st state, which I know is you're not supposed to say that, a lot of these issues would go away. The market would be bigger, the concentration ratios would be smaller, firms would be bigger. But I have to say that's two need to play that game. And I have to say that President Biden's recent proposals to talk about Buy America, which we've opposed, not that there's anything wrong with making government procurement reciprocal. We shouldn't, in my opinion, we shouldn't be buying from the Chinese because they don't have a buy. They don't ever buy from us. But Canada is different. You're in the government procurement agreement, I believe, and so that would be one way. If both our countries were to say, wait a minute, when we procure our goods and services for government, it's government influence like a contract. We're not going to keep Canada out of it. I think that's a huge mistake that the United States is making. And I know there has been some discussion in Canada. I read, I think maybe in the Globe and Mail a couple of days ago, where they're, well, we should do the same thing. I get the feeling, I understand the emotion behind that, but that would just, again, make Canadian firms even smaller. So, more integration, I think, more embrace of globalization, especially fair globalization where the markets are open on both sides. That would certainly help.
Classic cutting off nose to spite face policy, right? If someone's mean to you, you want to be mean to them, but you don't stop to think about how that might actually harm your own people in the process. You also recommend that policymakers they calibrate merger policy to consider improved productivity and global competitiveness. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that Canada has in its competition law, which I'm not sure how long, but it was for I think maybe 30 years. It's incorporated this competitiveness lens. So it evaluates mergers through the impact on Canadian competitiveness. The U.S. does not do that, and it's a huge mistake for the U.S. So I really strongly oppose many of the neo-Brandeisians in Canada who say, well, we should get rid of that. We should just evaluate merger or antitrust rules on just competition purely. If you do that and you weaken, strong Canadian global competitors, those firms will be weakened and there'll be fewer jobs there. So, antitrust authorities have to consider in traded sectors. Now, it doesn't matter what you do with hospitals, hospital mergers, there's no traded component of that, but in traded sectors, mining and aerospace and all these other things, you have to consider the global impacts and not just assume that, well, we don't really care about that. Especially when you look at a lot of other countries now. The EU, for example, is moving in that direction to incorporate competitiveness. The Chinese, that's the center of their antitrust policy, is competitiveness.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to reframe things too, because Canada, as you say, is obviously a very export-oriented country, and if we're focusing on the size of our sort of big businesses only within the Canadian context, of course, they're going to look like very big fish in a very small pond. But if you expand the scope to the global field, suddenly it actually becomes important that those Canadian businesses be very big in order that they can, first of all, survive and also thrive in the ocean rather than in the pond, so to speak.
Yeah, and also just one of the problems with how a lot of folks look at antitrust is they'll look only at the domestic market. Most traded firms, they're all traded firms, their market competition is coming from around the world. That's what's disciplining them, not just the size of the Canadian market.
Yeah, that's an important point. That's often overlooked. You mentioned, and this actually fits with another paper that we just put out on competition policy. You say that government should resist the temptation to overhaul competition policy based on changes in industry. Right now, obviously, one of the hot topics is big tech. A lot of talk about big tech, being super profitable, not having any competition. They're sort of running amok. So you're saying that governments need to be careful to sort of not overhaul policies that have been placed for a long time based on sort of what are seen as sort of recent changes in the economic structure of a country.
Yeah, I would argue that those changes are very consistent with what's going on. They're not structural changes that are like, oh, they require a whole new framework. I guess two activists or advocates in Canada, Vas Bedar and Robin Shaban, write that the Canadian Competition Act was not designed to protect competition in the digital world. They say it's unable to reliably address current issues such as algorithmic accountability, dominance of digital firms, role of data, et cetera, et cetera. Well, first of all, competition policy was never designed to do that. If you're worried about privacy, you pass a privacy law. If you're worried about algorithmic accountability, let's say in finance, you make sure that your finance laws have rules about how you can use algorithms. For example, in the US, we have the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and any use of algorithms by companies in the credit side of the economy, those are automatically going to be governed by that rule. So it's sort of forcing all these tasks into competition policy that was never designed for. That's not the role of competition policy. Secondly, when you think about, well, it's unfit for this. No, it's perfectly fit for this. You can look at any big tech company and through competition authorities, and you can say, did they behave in a way that violated our law? Did they intentionally use their competitive market power to distort competition or harm competitors? Now, that's different than did they compete fairly and, oh, by the way, they gained market share. That's what we want. Learned Hand, the famous Supreme Court justice, said you shouldn't be penalized for success. So the idea that somehow we need to change antitrust law, and again, I'm not enough of an expert in Canada, but that's certainly not true in the United States. Antitrust authorities have all the tools they need. Now, they might need a little bit more money, maybe, to staff up and make sure they have enough people to prosecute cases. But there's nothing inherently different about the economy of today that says, oh, we have to overhaul our antitrust laws. And I think that's to me, going down that path is a very dangerous path.
Yeah, so I guess in other words, it's just a question of the right tool for the problem at hand. I think a lot of people might agree there might be novel aspects to these new and emerging industries, but it's not with respect to competition. It's with respect to things like privacy and algorithms, and governments have other tools for those things that they might want to look at, but competition policy is just the wrong tool.
Yes, but also, let's, for example, the EU brought a case against Google. I don't want to pick on particular cases, but the case was essentially to say, when you go on Google, for example, and you put in, 25 Yonge Street, Toronto, what'll pop up will be a Google map. Cool, great, that's fantastic. And in Europe, they think that that's bad because somehow it's favoring Google. You can bring a case like that, but to me, the real case would be if Google were to distort what's called its organic search, where it's the ones below that where you see that, and they said, oh, we don't want any other map competitor to be in that, so we'll list them on page 10. That to me would be anti-competitive behavior. It would be able to be going after in a U.S. court of law, and the U.S. DOJ would probably win that case. So again, you don't need to have whole new sets of rules. If these companies are doing anti-competitive things that would intentionally hurt a competitor through unfair means, we already have the legal tools to go after them and to prosecute them. But again, there's a difference between, like, for example, some people complain, oh, well, Amazon, you go on and you type in batteries in Amazon, you can get ever-ready batteries or Duracell batteries, or you can get Amazon batteries, which are private label. And they want to say, oh, well, that's bad. Well, why? I'm
For
saving
whom?
money. Yeah, for whom? Certainly
Yep.
not for me. And if that's bad, then we should say that Loblaws can't have its own private label, or drugstores in Canada can't have their own private label. It's like, so it just really, to me, they just go way too far because they want to limit these bigger companies just because they're big.
Yeah, that's interesting when you point that out, because when you ask the question about anti-competitive behavior, it's who are we worrying about here, right? Isn't it supposed to be the consumer, or in some cases the employees? But here it seems to be like, well, that's bad for Google's competitor, or it's bad for Walmart's competitor. And I guess the question is, does that matter if it's not bad for you and me and other consumers who are, who is being harmed by that sort of arrangement?
Yeah, I just say quickly, Aaron, one of the things that I think that I find troubling about the argument that those people make is oftentimes they're progressives who sort of criticize business and want to be on the side of workers and consumers. And to me, that's what capitalism or a market economy is all about. I don't favor business. I have no desire to favor business. Business does what it does, and we have rules and framework around it because of what it does, because it produces innovation, it produces lower cost, higher quality goods, it gives workers good jobs. But somehow saying the job of antitrust now is to protect competitors in the marketplace, when did their interests start to trump average workers or average consumer interests? That to me is very disturbing and sort of strange in a way.
Yeah, it's almost like they've confused the means for the ends, right? The important thing about business and why markets are great is the outcomes for all of us, what it does for the world and for everyone's standard of living. But now suddenly, if the end has become sort of ensuring competition for its own sake, that seems like a strange departure from.
Well, it's also worse than that. I mean, this is, at least in the U.S., for the neo-Brandeisians, this is all about fundamentally restructuring the U.S. economy away from a large firm economy back to a small firm economy. There's one book that Matt Stoller, an advocate, wrote. I think it's called Goliath, and Matt literally says the U.S. was better off in the late 1800s when we were all small farmers and small shop workers, and we should go back to that. I don't want to go back. My great grandparents were that in Ontario, and I don't think they would have been very happy if they could have lived now. They would have been much happier living now than living. My grandfather had a little shop outside of Peterborough, and was able to make ends meet. But standard of living that was low then. Why would we want that again?
Well, and I also think I wonder the idea of if everyone had to purchase a craft car or a craft computer, flying a craft airplane, maybe it would be wonderful. But boy, I can't even imagine what the price would be to do that if you're having to bear the cost.
Yeah, and a lot of this, I'll say it. A lot of this is actually sort of knowledge class elitism. Like, I buy my craft brewed IPA and I can afford $10 for a 6-pack, but a lot of people want to buy Budweiser for $4, sure. Or I can buy arugula lettuce that's organic. Yeah, sure, nothing wrong with that if you want to do it, but somehow to sort of force the rest of us into that sort of consumption choice is pretty elitist.
I find it incredibly privileged when people say, well, I don't mind paying a little bit more for something.
Exactly.
Well, if you have the ability and you want to, feel free. But a lot of people don't have that luxury. They're trying to get bang for the buck.
Would you pay for them too?
Yeah. Well, that's what they're being asked of eventually.
Yeah.
One of your last recommendations is actually something for small business. You talk about one thing governments can do is find ways to help small business boost their productivity. So maybe talk a little bit about that, why that's important.
Yeah, so in any economy, you're going to have a mix of business sizes, small, medium, big. And in virtually every economy around the world, small firms are less productive. And so if you want to raise productivity, and that means raising living standards, you have to figure out a way to help small companies become more productive. In the US, for example, we have a program run out of the Department of Commerce called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. I think Canada used to have a program like that. I don't know if you still do, but it basically goes out and it works with small manufacturers to help them train their workers, to adopt better machine tools, to figure out ways to raise their productivity. It's a very successful and effective program. There's no reason we couldn't do that. For example, in other sectors, you look at the construction sector, for example. In construction in the US, it's dominated by small 5-person, 3-person, 10-person firms. And construction productivity in the US actually has declined over the last 30 years. It's less productive now than it was 30
Wow.
years ago. Well, there are all sorts of things you could do to help construction firms sort of pool into co-ops where they exchange information, maybe where they buy collectively. So there's a bunch of different things that you could do. My colleague Mike Lind and I wrote a piece about proposing these state sector-based small businesses co-ops. No reason you couldn't do that at the provincial level in the US to help firms, buy health insurance together, to maybe do joint R&D together, to help train their workers together, to get some of those economies of scale.
Yeah. We've got a question here too about collaboration between large and small firms. Canada has a program that was launched a few years ago called the Super Cluster program, where the government had selected industry areas, and then businesses could apply. They had to have a certain, I think there had to be, post-secondary institutions involved as well. Is that sort of thing a good idea, where you're partnering large firms with small firms? Is this something that is government best suited to do this? Is there merit to the idea of partnering larger firms with smaller firms?
Well, from the outside, I was a big fan of the supercluster idea. I haven't followed the actual implementation, so I can't say sort of how it played out. But the concept, I think, was a good one. We proposed something similar in the U.S., which is just passed in the House big spending bill. There was a proposal in there to create these kind of what we called at ITIF tech hubs. So I think the idea of small and big firms working more closely together can be a good one. There can be market failures, mostly around coordination. Everybody's just too busy to sort of put together, a consortium of some kind that would be working on a similar technology or similar issues around training their workers. So yeah, as long as government doesn't get too heavy-handed and really makes these still industry-led, I do think that there's a role for government for that kind of glue enabling kind of coordination.
And one last question. Today's small businesses are in some cases tomorrow's big businesses. We talk about the benefits of big business, but obviously businesses have to start somewhere. They aren't starting from big overnight. Is government policy, is protecting small business or sort of cultivating small business the only way we can get big businesses? Or are you saying that government needs to take an approach that's a little more calibrated than, protect all small businesses or cultivate all small businesses because they could be tomorrow's big business? Is that just too blunt an approach?
Yeah, and way too blunt. I mean, there's a good study by economists at University of Chicago, and they found that the vast majority of people who start a small business are what are called lifestyle entrepreneurs. A lot of them just don't want to work for somebody, which that makes a lot of sense. A lot of people want to work for themselves. They employ maybe their spouse or their kids or their relatives. But majority, like 80-90% of people who start small businesses in the US have no desire to become big. They're happy with 5 workers or 10 or 20, and it's a nice life. So we shouldn't assume that by protecting small businesses, we're automatically creating big ones. On the other hand, they're pretty clear signals or indicators of people who are high growth entrepreneurs who want to start a business and their aspiration is to make it much larger. Those are the kind of companies that I think policy should be focused on. That's why when I argue about this new business administration idea or shifting policy over to new entrants, I think what government should do, frankly, is try to identify those companies that are small and want to become big, and make sure that, are there any regulatory barriers in their way? I'll give you an example, good example in the US that we helped with. We have an R&D tax credit like you do, but you have to make profits to get the credit. And so Senator Chris Coons is a Democrat from Delaware. He put in a provision which we helped with and really liked, where you could get that credit to be a credit against your federal payroll taxes. So if you're a pre-profit small firm and you're growing, you're doing all this R&D, you don't have to wait 8 or 9 years in the future. You can get some you can get some real help right now. That to me is a really clever kind of idea to help high growth small firms get over that hump. So there's things like that that the governments can and should do. So absolutely, the more fast growing small business. I mean, I look at an economy is really the two core elements of any good economy are mid and large size firms who are highly productive and innovative, and smaller, high growth, innovative firms who want to get big. I mean, if you don't have both of those working together, you're going to be running on not as many cylinders as you should.
Yes. Well, that hour just flew by. As a great conversation, Rob. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I want to encourage everybody watching to check out the paper that's being released very shortly, within a few minutes. I think someone will put in the chat box a link to our mailing list if you're not on it, and we can send it directly in your inbox. You can also check out our website at Macdonald-Laurier.ca. And thank you, Rob, again for joining us, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you, Aaron.